And play games. We're not gonna play games tonight. We're doing a Discord react. So we have a Discord where everyone can put videos and stuff to react to, edits, whatever it may be. Me, other people, Instagram. And so we'd like to react to it, but we haven't done it like 3 days and it's backed up. Always a party and Ludawissy. Okay, well, all right. I still think you're Russian though. Okay. You know what? I'll take it over the people saying I'm actually a dude. Why do people think you are a dude? That's a good question. I also ask that. 10-foot tall Russian male spy. Okay, well.
Hi, I'm Ludo. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here or I keep popping up on your recommended, please make sure to subscribe. It really helps my channel grow. And that's all. Okay, bye-bye.
Ever since first stream, I felt wanted here. Most streams I've been in, either the chatters can't stand me or the streamers can't. Oh, here I feel no tension. Well, we try to welcome everyone in here. As long as you're weird, you fit in. The world's deadliest theme park.
Between 1978 and 1997, there was a theme park like
this is
no
not
other.
my theme park.
World called Great American Recreation, which crucially operated a ski resort in the Vernon Valley and Great Gorge skiing steeper trails, and by 1960, concrete, fiberglass, and asbestos. Patrons had injuries. In fact, it's reported that at not match the height of the bull edge, meaning boards would get stuck on the lip.
That's not
a former
Waterworld.
employee commented it was responsible
That's
for so
not
many
Waterworld,
injuries
no.
that we covered it up with dirt and pretended it never happened. And in fact, some of the rides were so dangerous they never even managed to open to the public at all. The Bailey Ball was such an attraction, essentially a large steel sphere with industrial roller wheels bolted all around the outside, creating what can only be described as a replica World War only above, separated from
Wait, I
each
need to
other.
see that
Some of the
clip one more
rides were
time.
so dangerous they never even managed to open to the public at all. The Bailey Ball was such an attraction, essentially a large steel sphere with industrial roller wheels bolted all around the outside, creating what can only be described as a replica World War II era anti-submarine mine. The idea was a human rider would be secured inside and rolled downhill on a PVC pipe track. However, when the state inspector arrived to see the ball in action, the summer heat had expanded the piping, causing the ball, with a man inside it, to fly off the tracks, rolling down the steep slope uncontrolled and travelling straight through the parking lot across Route 94 and finally coming to rest in a swamp. It's said that the inspector watched silently as the ball came to a rest before promptly leaving without saying a word. Management abandoned this masterpiece. After the first season, in 1978, Gene sought to expand his park, believing the best way to do this was, quote, by legalizing drunk driving, in a collection of attractions known as Motorworld. The first ride of note here was the Grand Prix track, featuring 3/4 size Formula One races that could travel at over 50 miles per hour. If that wasn't concerning enough, the park operated an alcohol drinks bar only a few meters away. Patrons would ride these races drunk and often underage using a fake driver's license. One employee actually broke into the park in the middle of the night, stole a Lola Racer, and disabled its inbuilt speed limiter before taking it for a joyride down Route 94. Police reportedly pursued the employee at over 90 miles per hour for several miles before he was apprehended. Similar to the Lola Racers were the super go-karts. Drivers were not required to present a license
That was
here,
not me.
which would not be so concerning were it not for the fact that the inbuilt speed limiter could be disabled by wedging in a tennis ball, enabling patrons to fly around at speeds reaching 50 miles an hour. A particularly unique injury that would occur here is that because the carts ran on petrol engines, the fume inhalations would regularly make patrons sick, and sometimes the gas caps would fly off the carts as people drove along, splashing out the liquid fuel and hitting drivers further behind in a kind of Mario Kart style attack. The super speedboats suffered a very similar issue. A tamer attraction nearby called bumper boats took the idea of hitting cars into each other and then put that on water. The problem was not with the bumper boats ride itself, more that patrons would treat the faster super speedboats as bumper boats, smashing the flimsy boats into each other at excessive speeds. Anyone too tall would have to dangle their legs over the side, and you can imagine just how regularly this caused lower extremity fractures. The engine fumes also coated the lake water in a kind of oily sheen, burning and irritating guests unlucky enough to fall into the water after a high-speed collision. Petrol-induced delirium was the reward for anyone who managed to stay inside the boat. And finally, another noteworthy attraction for Motorworld was one of the park's most popular attractions called Battle Action Tanks, featuring little mobile tanks that fired tennis balls from a cannon. If you shot another tank's hit point, it would temporarily disable movement, and static cannons placed on the arena's perimeter also allowed guests standing outside to fire in. This particular attraction was one of the staff's least favourite to guard because of the high likelihood of getting pelted with tennis balls that would fire at over 90 miles an hour while trying to perform maintenance in the area. But finally, the most loved and most infamous section of rides were gathered into an area known as Waterworld. Undoubtedly the most dangerous, these were the rides that would ultimately lead to the tragic downfall of Action Park. Probably the single most recognisable of all these rides was the Cannonball Loop, a fully enclosed water slide with a unique, completely vertical loop at the end. You tend not to see these at water parks for the perhaps unsurprising reason that shooting people out of a vertical loop is not necessarily conducive to their survival. The ride itself was built kind of by the eyeball, using some nearby car factory workers who had recently been made redundant as labour.
That's not my water park. We don't have that.
It was reported that one came back missing its head. To convince real humans to go down, the park offered employees $100, and eventually Eugene's son Andy was the first person to do so, but in full hockey protective gear. This ride suffered from an inevitable problem of physics. If a human body was either too light or too heavy, they often wouldn't have the right momentum to safely clear the loop and would get stuck at the top, crashing down on either side. Nosebleeds and facial and back injuries were extremely common, so much so that the ride was only open for a single month before the state's advisory board
we don't have
forced
anything
it shut,
that
considering
loops.
it too dangerous. Some early riders were even coming back with lacerations to their bodies, and when the ride was closed to determine what caused this, teeth that had been knocked out of previous riders' mouths were now lodged in the foam-lined interior walls, slicing open the next riders as they passed through. But the Cannonball Loop was by far from the only crazy installation.
What?
The Tarzan swing was a steel arch suspended from a cable over a spring-fed natural pool. Patrons waited in long lines for the chance to swing out and jump off into the water below. Because this spring was fed by mountain water, the temperature rarely exceeded 50 degrees, a fact most only came to appreciate as their bodies immediately went into hypothermic shock upon entering the water, where they would need immediate rescue after being unable to pull themselves back out.
I went to this one park called Wet and Wild growing up, and they have a one ride that's called the Hurricane, and you go up and you slide down and then you get dumped in this like toilet bowl kind of thing. You're not in a tube, it's just you on a slide. You just cross your arms and you go round and round and round and round until you slowly fall off, but there is rain coming down and you fall into a pool that is like 10 foot deep, 12 foot deep. And so I went down as like, I think I was 10, and because I was tall, and so I went down, but I was so small that once I went down, I was so disoriented and there's rain coming down. I didn't know where I was, that the lifeguard had to end up coming to grab me. And like, I thought I was going to drown. I literally that day, I was like, this is it. I'm going to die. I was like, God, I'm coming to see you soon. I'm sorry for my sins, God. Like, I'm coming to see you. And he literally came and grabbed me and pulled me out. And when I got out, I talked to my dad because my dad went down the same thing. He had to have a lifeguard, and that dude is big. Like, that dude should not be drowning. And my dad was like, yeah, we're not going to go down that one again. That one almost caused me to drown. He was like, that's crazy. That's literally insane. The Hurricane? Yeah. So you literally just kind of drop off into it, and you just kind of sink, and then there's water, like, raining down. It's crazy.
On for too long, you risked crashing into the concrete platform at the far side of the pool, something that broke many ankles and toes, but that's just a skill issue really. In fact, unsuspected danger was a prevalent theme of Waterworld. At the Aquascoot, patrons would skim across a shallow pool of water only slightly deeper than a puddle in places, using a plastic sled in the same manner as skipping a stone over a lake. However, if you lean too far forward or back, the edge of the sled would bite into the water, catapulting the rider's head directly forward into the shallow puddle, resulting in serious injuries. Even if you avoided this, often the attendant would have already let the next rider down, slamming straight into the back of you. The collection of raft-based artificial whitewater rides were also notoriously dangerous. Roaring Rapids was built to look like a natural river, complete with jagged rocks and sharp overhangs that fractured femurs, collarbones, and dislocated knees and shoulders. One of the courses featured a toilet bowl which flushed riders down into a dark tunnel. a tunnel lined with foam padding that would often tear away from the walls, narrowing the hole and causing human riders to clog the toilet. Attendants would then have to quickly turn off the water supply to stop those congested patrons from drowning. Surf Hill was another infamous attraction. Patrons would slide down a wet sloped surface on foam mats at high speed, landing in a very shallow puddle. The barriers between lanes were minimal and people frequently collided with each other on the way down or at the end. The 7th lane was known as the backbreaker due to a special bump midway intended to allow jumps and splashdowns into a larger puddle. It also had a reputation for causing serious injury, but both employees and spectators much loved this ride for one very particular quirk. You see, Surf Hill was especially good at separating women from their bikini tops. Women would stand up at the end of the surf and, disorientated from hitting the plastic ridges at high speeds, wouldn't realize that they had emerged significantly less covered than they began the ride. A nearby snack bar was installed specifically to take advantage of this view.
There's no way. You're joking. You're actually joking. You're actually joking. There's no... You can't make this up, bro. You know what? I need this ad. I need this ad to mentally reset. There's no way. A snack bar.
However, a single ride stood out from all the others. A ride so deadly it quickly became known by employees as the Grave Pool. The tidal wave pool opened at the start of Action Park's 1981 season. The pool was 100 feet wide and 250 feet long and could hold 500 to 1,000 people at once. This was a seriously large and deep wave pool. The waves were generated by underwater machines for 20 minutes at a time with 10-minute breaks and could reach a whopping 1 meter high. The comparative calm of the water in break periods contrasted with the severity of those waves in a relatively deep pool that got deeper towards the machine end, meant that patrons would often get sucked much deeper into the pool than they intended, only realizing their mistake when they were in over their depth with nowhere to stand up. Because of the unrestricted entry, the water would often be covered in a dense packed layer of floating rings, which would keep people trapped underwater if they got swept down. The dangerous conditions would often cause people to crowd at the relatively few ladders to escape. 12 lifeguards were on duty permanently, and on high traffic weekends as many as 30 people would need to be rescued from drowning. For comparison, a regular pool lifeguard will usually make 0 or a single rescue per year. In fact, when a consultant lifeguard arrived to make recommendations to improve safety, he was so overwhelmed by the severity of the conditions, he simply disappeared and never returned.
My water park has maybe like 4 drownings a day, and we're getting better. And it's in our instructions that you have to know how to swim. So it's not my fault if someone drowns.
And out of the hundreds of near drownings, on 3 separate occasions, the wave pool would prove to be fatal. In July of 1982, a 15-year-old boy named George Lopez would drown. 2 years later, 20-year-old Donald DePass and...
What? I thought he was an actor.
Finally, in July 1987, 18-year-old Gregory Grandchamps. These were not the only deaths at Action Park. The first reported death was in 1980, when 19-year-old George Larson Jr. was riding the Alpine slide after hours. His cart jumped the tracks, and when ejected, George's head struck a rock. He died from his injuries 8 days later in hospital. Then on the 1st of August 1982, only 2 days after the drowning of George Lopez, 27-year-old Jeffrey Nathan was riding in an attraction we actually haven't covered yet, called the Kayak Experience, which, despite sounding and being relatively tame compared to some of the other attractions, featured a hidden deadly secret.
The 80s, y'all, different time. I would have went. It was fun. Yeah, the 80s where people just died and people were okay with it. Huh? Just because it was a different time doesn't mean if people are dying, you go, I probably shouldn't go.
Lurking under the water. The Kayak Experience was an artificial whitewater kayak run powered by underwater fans that agitated the water to provide the current. Frequently, kayaks would tip over or get lodged
Loki, I am
among the
taking
concrete
notes.
rocks,
This one does look fine. This one doesn't look too dangerous.
Patrons would have to step out of the kayak in order to right it again. When Jeffrey stepped out, his foot touched a grill covering one of those electrified fans. A 19-ampere current passed into his body and caused him to go into cardiac arrest. He later died in a nearby hospital. And finally, sometime during 1984, a man died after suffering cardiac arrest, allegedly caused by the shock of...
I thought they were going to say he got sucked down in there. Oh my word, I thought they were going to say he got sucked in there. Ooh.
Cold water in the pool beneath the Tarzan swing. The water that day was believed to be around 50 degrees. So at this point, let's go a little deeper into how and why Action Park was so dangerous and how it managed to continue
Back
running
in the 80s,
for
we
so
just
long.
died and
Firstly,
moved on.
many of the staff attendants were teenagers and poorly, if at all, trained. Many were under the influence of alcohol while working, and training was never taken particularly seriously. The former security director, Jim Desai, got the job at age 21. They cared little for enforcing the rules, and considering the attitude of at least quite a few of the patrons, that's not entirely surprising. Sometimes physical altercations occurred between visitors or each other and staff. There was often physical disparity in favor of the patrons, and the teenage attendants didn't feel they had the power to discipline adult guests and would struggle to enforce the rules. This was definitely exacerbated by the availability and prevalence of alcohol.
Wait, this is supposed to be done in one of those tubes. You're doing this all willy-nilly.
On site. Beer was sold pretty much everywhere, and the drinking age rules were enforced in a particularly lax manner. The generally short distance between many of these kiosks and the rides involving operating motor vehicles with no safety equipment in a bathing suit really set people up for a rough time. It's fair to say that because Action Park was closer and slightly cheaper than the neighboring Six Flags Great Adventure Park, many of the patrons were from lower income communities who had less opportunity to learn how to swim. And the fact that the park was advertised heavily to the Spanish and Polish communities nearby, even though that there were no translated instructions, did set the park up for some trouble. There was a fundamental clash between how people viewed Action Park and what it intended itself to be. See, Gene's philosophy was that Action Park existed in a similar way a beach does. If someone swims out at a beach and drowns, it's a tragic accident, but there is more of a perceived onus on the swimmer for going out and making bad decisions and getting beyond their depth. Dying on a roller coaster, however, does feel somewhat different. You're kind of strapped and there's no skill involved in staying alive.
There's no way they're saying if you die, it's your fault. There's no way. They made a stinking ride, said, hey, if you die, GG skill issue. Next. Wow. Wow.
A roller coaster, but it's been suggested that many of the patrons took that roller coaster attitude to Action Park and held not enough regard for their safety in the face of prevalent dangers because they never expected to need a level of control over the danger to stay safe. People just didn't realize that the wave pool was a genuine threat to life if used incorrectly, and the lifeguards regularly had to rescue people who jumped into the deep end without actually being able to swim. And again, turning to how the theme park ran for so many years with such a poor safety record, there are actually multiple interesting contributing factors. Because many of the rides were pioneering at the time, often built out of wild imagination as opposed to stringent engineering and testing, it was difficult for the regulatory authorities to control Action Park's rides. Especially in the early days, if a person survived a test run and nothing visually was falling apart, that was considered adequately safe. It's probably not a huge leap to also say that a special relationship existed between Action Park and the state, as the park was only ever fined once in its operating history. In fact, there's a humorous anecdote that when the local government complained about the high demand for ambulances generated by Action Park, Gene simply bought the local hospital a new fleet of vehicles. Accident and injury reporting was often not done correctly or at all, and in cases where a claimant sought liability for injury, the park's legal attack dog attorney
Waterworld puts safety first.
Viciously fight tooth and nail. In fact, it became difficult for victims to hire legal representation from the local lawyers purely because they all knew just how hard Action Park would fight every single claim through to trial. This was quite unusual for a business, but this is where we get to the downfall of Action Park.
The downfall? What? This wasn't already the downfall?
Action Park wasn't forced closed, it actually went bankrupt. GAR simply couldn't contend with paying for everyone who got injured there. As one litigant alleged in the early 1990s, there were over 2,400 active or past litigants who were seeking compensation against GAR. It turned out that the reason Action Park fought so hard to avoid paying was simply because they had no insurance. It's surprisingly expensive to insure for rides that have a tendency to maim and kill, so Gene came up with a pretty ingenious solution. He just set up his own fake insurance company called London and World and insured Action Park for nominal cost. He then did something really crafty and underwrote his fake insurance company.
I'm gonna make my own insurance. Oh my word. I'm gonna make Waterwissy's own insurance. And we're going to insure ourselves.
With an actual real firm called Dover Insurance, saying to anyone who asked that they would cover any gaps in his own coverage. Dover, and nobody else, realised that this meant they'd be covering literally any payouts. It was a clever workaround that avoided Gene needing to pay any premiums while still technically operating with some coverage. Not surprisingly, the government were not happy to find this out, but Gene did make the argument. He paid out of his own pocket whenever someone got injured. And by February 1996, the constant legal attacks culminated with the creditors who had taken on
imagine, I bet so many people went there just trying to get a lawsuit. I bet so many people went and said, you know what, I'm gonna go get hurt and get paid out.
$14 million debt, petitioning the company to force it into bankruptcy. And a year later, in 1997, they announced the cessation of all operations. What followed was, in short, a changing of hands between multiple owners, modifications, closures, to produce a much tamer version of the original Action Park. Many of the ride's most dangerous attractions were either removed completely, buried, or made significantly tamer. The Action Park that ran for 2 decades was no more. A huge reason why Action Park continued for so long was simply because it was loved by a great many people. In fact, the park often made the argument that although a lot of people were injured and, well, killed sometimes, they did serve millions and millions of customers every year who had a great experience. Gene's fundamental ethos was to put people in control of their action, and this unique experiment created great memories for a lot of people. The bumps and injuries were often considered a source of pride and proof that you had survived Action Park. But thanks to woke, children these days pretty much will never get the chance to experience the sheer joy of entering cardiac arrest halfway down an artificial water chute composed entirely of rebar concrete and exposed wiring. And I think that's a great shame. Action Park is a unique relic of a long gone pre-health and safety era of history that could never realistically be replicated today. If you enjoyed this video and want to dive in any further...
I don't want to dive nowhere near Action Park, not gonna lie. No thank you.